So when he agreed to appear on a popular late-night talk show, he already knew what was coming. The host, a well-known liberal firebrand, had built a career on mocking conservatives, traditionalists, and anyone who didn't fall in line with the latest cultural trends. And tonight, Eastwood was his target. The audience was primed for it. The moment Eastwood took his seat, the host leaned forward, a smirk creeping across his face. "Clint, you've been in this business a long time," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "Do you ever feel like maybe it's time to step aside? Let the new generation take over?" A few audience members chuckled. The host grinned, sensing an easy win. "I mean, no offense," he continued, "but the world is changing. Some would say your style, your whole persona, is a little outdated." The crowd erupted in laughter, fully expecting Eastwood to stumble, to get defensive, maybe even lose his cool. But Clint Eastwood was Clint Eastwood. He didn't flinch. Instead, he simply leaned back in his chair, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. "That's cute," he said, his voice calm, steady. "But let me ask you something. When was the last time people lined up to watch your movies?" The laughter in the audience died almost instantly. The host's smirk faltered. Eastwood continued, his eyes locked onto the man across from him. "See, the thing about experience is, it doesn't go out of style. Good storytelling doesn't expire. People don't watch my films because I tell them to. They watch because they want to." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And as long as they do, I don't need permission from anyone to keep doing what I love." The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the audience, many of whom had been laughing just moments before, seemed to hesitate. They weren't sure whether they were still in on the joke, or if Clint Eastwood had just flipped the entire conversation on its head. The host, clearly rattled, forced a laugh. "Well, I guess you've still got a few fans out there." Eastwood smirked. "More than a few." And then, as if to prove his point, the crowd erupted, not in laughter this time, but in applause. It started slowly, then built into something undeniable. People in the audience, even those who had come expecting to see Eastwood embarrassed, found themselves clapping, cheering. Because deep down they knew he was right. By the time the interview aired, the clip had already gone viral. Millions of views, countless comments, people from all walks of life praising Eastwood's poise, his confidence, his refusal to be bullied. The host tried to downplay it, but it was too late. The moment had become bigger than him. In the end, Clint Eastwood didn't need to shout, didn't need to insult, didn't need to beg for respect. He simply reminded the world of who he was. And just like that, with nothing more than a quiet, unwavering response, he won. As the days passed, Clint Eastwood's response spread like wildfire. News outlets replayed the clip, social media exploded with praise, and countless people, young and old, shared their admiration for the legendary actor's unshakable confidence. The late-night host, on the other hand, found himself in an unexpected predicament. What was supposed to be a routine takedown had backfired spectacularly. His usual audience wasn't laughing this time. Instead, people were questioning why he had tried to humiliate a man who had nothing left to prove. Memes flooded the internet. One of the most popular showed Eastwood calmly sipping a cup of coffee with the caption, "When you've seen it all and don't have time for nonsense." Another had a split image. On one side, the host grinning smugly. On the other, Eastwood, delivering his legendary response. The text underneath read, "One is a moment, the other is a legacy." Hollywood insiders couldn't ignore it either. A-list actors, directors, and producers, many of whom had stayed silent in the face of cancel culture, quietly applauded Eastwood. Some even reached out privately to say what many were thinking. That was long overdue. The real shock came at the box office. Eastwood's latest film, which had been tracking for a modest opening, suddenly surged in ticket sales. Fans who had grown tired of the endless cycle of outrage and manufactured controversies showed up in droves to support him. When asked about the viral moment in a follow-up interview, Eastwood remained as cool as ever. "People like to stir the pot," he said with a shrug. "Me? I just keep working. But the host wasn't so lucky. His attempt to regain control of the narrative failed. Every time he tried to dismiss Eastwood's response, it only made things worse. The internet wasn't letting this one go. A few weeks later, as Eastwood walked through the streets of Carmel, a young man approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, "I just wanted to say, that was incredible. You shut that guy down without even trying." Eastwood chuckled, tipping his hat. As Clint Eastwood strolled down the quiet streets of Carmel, he couldn't help but reflect on how little things had really changed. The world was louder now, more chaotic, more reactive, but at its core, the same truths still held. Strength wasn't about shouting the loudest or tearing others down. It was about knowing who you were and never letting anyone shake that foundation. Meanwhile, the late-night host found himself struggling to move past the moment. His attempt to frame Eastwood as an out-of-touch relic had failed spectacularly. Instead of being seen as the clever provocateur, he had become the punchline. His show's ratings took a noticeable dip, and his attempts to recapture the audience's attention with more sensationalism only made things worse. The more he tried to control the narrative, the more the world moved on, without him. Eastwood, on the other hand, continued as he always had. His latest film was now a surprise box office hit, proving that audiences still craved stories told with grit and heart. A few studio executives who had once written him off suddenly found themselves reevaluating their stance. A meeting was even arranged with a major streaming service, eager to produce an exclusive documentary about his legendary career. But Eastwood wasn't interested in looking back just yet. He still had work to do. One evening, as he sat outside, a small cafe enjoying the cool breeze, an older man approached him. "Clint," he said, shaking his head with a chuckle, "you've been shutting these people down your whole life. You ever get tired of it?" Eastwood smirked, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Nah," he said. "I just don't go looking for it, but if they come knocking, well, I don't mind reminding them what real toughness looks like." The man laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Seems like the world needs it more than ever." Eastwood simply nodded. He had never set out to be a symbol of defiance, nor had he ever cared much for the games people played. He had built his legacy not by fighting battles in the press, but by focusing on his craft, on telling great stories, on doing the work. The sun dipped below the horizon, Clint Eastwood stood up, tipped his hat, and walked off into the night. Not because he had something to prove, but because that's what legends do. They don't linger. They just keep moving forward. Months passed, and the media cycle moved on, as it always did. The late-night host, once riding high on controversy, found himself struggling to stay relevant. His attempt to humiliate Clint Eastwood had not only failed but had solidified Eastwood's status as a legend even further. Meanwhile, Eastwood continued doing what he did best, working. He quietly announced another film, this time a Western, a genre many had declared dead. But with Clint Eastwood at the helm, audiences knew better. The buzz around the project grew, and soon enough, Hollywood's biggest names were clamoring for roles. Even younger actors, many of whom had spent years in an industry obsessed with trends, wanted to be part of something timeless. They weren't just looking for a job, they wanted to work with a man who had outlasted them all. On the first day of filming, as the cameras rolled, Eastwood took his place behind the lens. He was older now, sure, but his presence was as strong as ever. When he called action, the set fell silent. Everyone knew they were part of something special. The E.E. film's release was a massive event. Audiences flooded theaters. Critics had no choice but to acknowledge its brilliance, and once again, Clint Eastwood defied the industry's expectations. The movie didn't just succeed, it became a cultural moment. And then, in a strange twist of fate, the late-night host, whose career had been fading, attempted to reach out. He invited Eastwood back on his show, this time under the guise of reconciliation. His team framed it as a friendly conversation, a chance to bury the hatchet. Eastwood didn't respond. Instead, he kept doing what he always had, making movies, living life, and ignoring the noise. One night, after a private screening of his film, a reporter managed to catch him outside the theater. "Clint," he asked, microphone in hand, "how does it feel to still be proving people wrong after all these years?" Eastwood smirked. "I don't waste time proving people wrong," he said. "I just do what I do. If that bothers them, well, that's their problem." The clip went viral, again. And with that, Clint Eastwood did what he always did. He tipped his hat, turned on his heel, and walked away, unbothered, unshaken, and still the last man standing. As Clint Eastwood walked away from the flashing cameras and eager reporters, the moment felt like something out of one of his own films, cool, effortless, and undeniably powerful. The internet exploded once again. The clip of his response was shared millions of times with fans and admirers praising his unwavering attitude. Memes, quotes, and even t-shirts with "I don't waste time proving people wrong" printed across the front flooded social media. Meanwhile, the late-night host found himself at a crossroads. His desperate attempt to bring Eastwood back onto his show had been ignored, and his ratings continued to decline. The very audience he once commanded had grown tired of the endless cycle of forced outrage. They wanted something real, something solid, something Clint Eastwood had always represented. Back in Carmel, Eastwood continued his work unaffected by the noise. He spent his mornings walking the coastline, greeting locals who had known him for decades, and his afternoons in the editing room, shaping his latest masterpiece. Then came the night of the film's premiere. The red carpet was packed, the theater buzzing with excitement. As Eastwood stepped out of the car, a roar erupted from the crowd, not the artificial kind that Hollywood PR teams manufacture, but the genuine cheers of people who had followed his career for generations. Reporters rushed forward. "Mr. Eastwood, this movie has already broken pre-sale records. How does it feel?" He adjusted his jacket, took a moment, then answered in the only way Clint Eastwood could. "Like I've still got work to do." That quote became the headline everywhere. Even those who had once dismissed him had to admit, Clint Eastwood wasn't just relevant. He was a force of nature. As the premiere ended and the credits rolled, a standing ovation filled the theater. People knew they had just witnessed something special, something timeless. And in the back of the room, away from the cameras and the flashing lights, the late-night host sat quietly, watching it all unfold. He had come to see for himself, to understand why the world gravitated toward this man. As he watched Eastwood shake hands, share laughs, and walk off into the night, he finally understood. Clint Eastwood didn't fight battles. He didn't chase approval. He didn't argue with those who doubted him, he just was, and that more than anything was why he would always win. A few days after the premiere, Clint Eastwood's film shattered box office records. The industry, which had spent years dismissing him as part of a bygone era, was forced to acknowledge the undeniable truth. Clint Eastwood wasn't just still relevant. He was defining what relevance truly meant. Hollywood executives scrambled to analyze the film's success. Was it nostalgia? Star power? The timeless appeal of a well-told story? But those closest to Eastwood knew the answer was simpler than that. He had never chased trends, never tried to appease shifting cultural winds. He made films his way, and audiences respected that. Meanwhile, the late-night host who had once mocked Eastwood found himself in an unfamiliar position, on the outside looking in. His jokes about the legendary actor no longer landed. His attempts to reignite the controversy fell flat. Viewers had moved on, tired of cynicism disguised as wit. One evening, in a last-ditch effort to reclaim the moment, the host made a public statement. In an interview, he admitted, "I underestimated Clint Eastwood. He's got something Hollywood forgot about, a backbone." The admission made headlines, but Eastwood never responded. He didn't need to. His silence, as always, spoke louder than any words. Instead, he stayed focused on what mattered, his work. He had already started outlining his next project, another film that no doubt would defy expectations. And as he sat at his favorite table in a quiet Carmel cafe, enjoying his usual black coffee, a stranger approached. It was a young filmmaker, no older than 30, nervous but eager. "Mr. Eastwood, I just wanted to say, I grew up watching your movies. You've inspired me more than I can put into words." Eastwood looked up, studying the young man for a moment before offering a slight nod. "Then stop talking about it and go make something." The filmmaker grinned. "Yes, sir." And with that, Eastwood turned back to his coffee, content. The world could debate, critique, and speculate all it wanted. He wasn't concerned with proving anything to anyone. Because when the dust settled, when all the noise faded away, one truth remained. Clint Eastwood wasn't just still standing, he was still leading. Months passed, and Clint Eastwood remained as steady as ever, unfazed by the whirlwind of media attention that followed his latest triumph. His film continued to dominate the box office, proving once again that audiences craved authenticity over spectacle. Studios, once hesitant to invest in traditional storytelling, now scrambled to replicate his success. But Eastwood didn't concern himself with Hollywood's reactions. He had spent decades in an industry that thrived on chasing trends, and he had never once followed the pack. While others worried about algorithms and social media engagement, he focused on what he had always done: telling damn good stories. One afternoon, as he walked through Carmel's quiet streets, a journalist approached him. Not the aggressive, agenda-driven type, but a young reporter who genuinely admired his work. "Mr. Eastwood," she asked hesitantly, "after all the success, after proving everyone wrong again, what keeps you going?" Eastwood paused, considering her question. Then with a small smirk, he replied, "Haven't found a reason to stop yet." That simple line became yet another viral sensation. Fans and aspiring artists alike took it as a mantra, a reminder that passion, not validation, was the key to longevity. Meanwhile, the late-night host who had once tried to humiliate Eastwood found himself fading into irrelevance. The ratings for his show continued to plummet, and the smug arrogance that once defined his persona now felt hollow. In an industry obsessed with tearing people down, Eastwood had shown the power of simply standing tall. The years rolled on, and Clint Eastwood remained an unstoppable force. He directed another film, one critics initially dismissed, only to watch it soar to success. He kept living life on his own terms, taking quiet walks through town, enjoying the company of old friends, and never once looking back. And one day, as he sat at a small cafe, sipping his usual black coffee, a group of young actors at a nearby table whispered among themselves, stealing glances in his direction. One of them, encouraged by the others, finally worked up the courage to approach. "Mr. Eastwood," the young actor said nervously, "I just wanted to say, I hope I can have a career like yours someday." Eastwood studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Then quit hoping," he said. "Go earn it." The young actor grinned, nodding eagerly before rushing back to his friends. Clint Eastwood simply took another sip of coffee, watching the world go by, just as he always had. No matter what changed around him, he remained what he had always been: unshaken, unstoppable, and the very definition of a legend. Years passed, but Clint Eastwood never slowed down. While Hollywood obsessed over fleeting trends, he remained a steady force, defying expectations with every new project. His films continued to captivate audiences, not because of marketing gimmicks or social media hype, but because they told real, honest stories, something that was becoming increasingly rare in the industry. Meanwhile, the late-night host who once tried to humiliate him had all but disappeared from the public eye. His show had been canceled after years of declining ratings, and he had quietly faded into obscurity. No one was talking about him anymore, while Eastwood's legacy only grew stronger. One evening, Eastwood attended a private screening of his latest film, a powerful Western that critics were already calling one of his finest works. As the credits rolled, the audience rose to its feet, giving him a standing ovation. But as always, Clint remained humble. He shook hands, exchanged a few words, and then, as the noise of the crowd swelled around him, he quietly slipped out the side door into the cool night air. A young reporter caught up with him outside. "Mr. Eastwood," she asked, out of breath. After all these years, do you ever think about retiring? Eastwood chuckled, adjusting his hat. Retire from what? He asked. Living? The reporter smiled, realizing she had just been given another classic Clint Eastwood quote. The next morning, headlines everywhere read, Clint Eastwood refuses to slow down. Retire from what? Living. It became yet another viral moment, inspiring fans, filmmakers, and even those outside the industry. People admired not just his work, but his mindset, the unwavering belief that as long as he was breathing, he still had something to give. And so, Clint Eastwood kept moving forward, never looking back, never chasing approval. He didn't need to prove anything. He never had. Because when history looked back on the greats, his name wouldn't just be remembered, it would be etched in stone.